Hey guys, so today I'm here with the AFE Magnum Force Stage 2 XP ProGuard 7 cold air intake in black, fitting all 2018 and newer JL Wranglers with that 3.6 liter V6 engine. So if you've noticed that your JL is a little bit sluggish off the line, maybe you've added some extra weight, some larger wheels and tires, and you're not getting that throttle response or that fuel efficiency that you once had, a cold air intake is a perfect solution to gain some horsepower and torque gains, ultimately gaining that throttle response and MPG back. This one by AFE is going to do just that. It's going to be a high quality intake that's going to open up that airflow, and it's going to have a dyno gain of 21 horsepower and 19 foot-pounds of torque, while also improving your engine noise. So as Jeep owners, we don't usually spend a lot of time in that higher RPM range, and that's where you're going to see those horsepower and torque gains. However, what you're going to notice out of this intake is that throttle response, that improvement in getting off of the line, while also gaining a little bit of that fuel efficiency back. Now this is going to be an open or exposed box design. You are getting a heat shield here to seal to the top, keeping all that hot engine bay air out. However, this is going to be a little bit more exposed to the elements, so if you are in a wetter climate, if you are looking to do a little bit of water forging, I wouldn't recommend this to you. I would recommend an enclosed box option or even a snorkel option. So this is really going to be for someone staying away from water and in a drier climate. This is also going to have a large dry filter on here, maximizing filtration and staying high flow, but it's also going to require a lot less maintenance than an oiled filter. So if you are looking to just quickly clean this out, throw it back in, this is going to be a great option for you. Overall, it's also just going to look a lot sportier as well as just a lot more attractive than your factory airbox, giving you a nicer look underneath your hood. So this is going to be roughly $360, making this averagely priced for a higher quality intake. Now you do have AFE, a premium brand, backing that premium price point, so I definitely think that if you're looking for something that's a little bit higher quality, then it's well worth the price. Now in comparison to other options, this has a little bit more going on to it than other simple options on the page, which you would expect out of a higher priced or higher quality option. Now this is going to maximize your filtration, it's going to maximize that airflow, and it's also just overall going to be a very quality build. It's also going to be fairly easy to install and has pretty good fitment, as you can tell sitting on our Wrangler right now. So the only nitpick that I do have about this intake is that it's not carb certified. So if you do live in an emission restrictive state, I would keep that in mind when shopping around. However, if that's not the case and you're looking for a well-built and quality intake and you're not really concerned about your budget when buying one, I think this is a really good option to take a look at. So install is going to be fairly simple. It's going to be a 1 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter, maybe taking you an hour to get this installed with a couple of basic hand tools. So speaking of that install, let's jump into that now. The tools that I used for my install were an impact wrench, a pair of dikes or snips, an 8mm socket, a 10mm socket, a flathead screwdriver, a 4mm Allen socket, a 10mm shallow socket, a 3/8" drive ratchet, and a trim removal tool. So obviously our first step is going to be to pop the hood, then we're going to disconnect a couple of things that are connected to our intake before we fully remove it. So I'm going to take a trim removal tool and we're going to remove a couple of clips that are holding on our IAT sensor wire on our resonator here. So there's going to be 2 tabs here and then a tab over here. Then we can remove the sensor for our IAT sensor. This is your intake air temperature sensor. We can just depress that clip and pull it out. Now we will be removing this in just a little bit and transferring it over to our new intake system, but we can keep that there as of right now, and we can move on to our PCV hose. So all you have to do is just squeeze this and give it a good tug back. That's going to be attached to our new intake as well. Then we can remove these 2 bolts up front that's actually holding our intake tube in place. I'm going to take a 10mm socket and go ahead and remove those. So next step is heading up to the throttle body clamp. I'm going to take an 8mm socket and go ahead and loosen up this clamp. You can also take a flathead screwdriver. As you can tell, there is a notch in there. An 8mm socket works out a little bit better. Then we can wiggle that off. So after our intake is disconnected from our throttle body, it will be free enough to remove. However, we do need to remove this last bolt from our air box. So I'm gonna use that 10mm socket again, and then we'll be able to fully remove our intake. So now we can pop our intake out of place and fully remove it. So like I mentioned before, we do have to remove our IAT sensor and switch it over to our new intake system. So all you really have to do is twist this off. I am gonna use a flathead just to get this tab over this piece here. Go ahead and twist it. You do need to lift up on the tab to clear that because that's gonna lock it in place. And then once you have that over, you can twist and pull that out. So before we can go ahead and install this on our Wrangler, we do have to do a little bit of assembly. Now we're not gonna put the whole intake system together. We do have to install our heat shield on our Wrangler first before we can go ahead and put the intake tube and the filter on there. But first we're going to take this gasket. This is what's gonna seal to the hood and keep all of that hot engine bay out. So we're just gonna line the top of our heat shield with that. If you do have to trim it, that is normal. You can just take a pair of snips or dikes and go ahead and cut that off because there is a metal wire in here, and that's what's going to keep that on there. So it looks like we're going to have to do a small trim. So I am just going to take a pair of snips and just cut off the end here. So after that's on there, we do have to put our fitting for our filter on. So you want to make sure that the smaller inlet is facing the outside of the heat shield. Then we can take our 4mm Allen head bolts and line up our coupler. So after you have all of those threaded in, we can take a 4mm Allen key. I'm just using an Allen socket here, and we can go ahead and tighten those down. So after we have our heat shield all together, we can move on transferring over our IAT sensor. Now you are going to have a fitting down at the bottom for that, and it's going to be very similar to your OEM fitting. So we don't need any grommet or anything. We can just take our IAT sensor and wiggle that in. There is going to be a tab just like your factory fitting. You want to make sure that that sits flat over that tab. So before we go ahead and install our new system on our Wrangler, I did want to sit it next to our stock one and show you guys a little bit of a comparison. Now I did loosely put this together. This is not together fully. We will have to install our heat shield first and then put the rest of the intake together, but I wanted to give you guys a visual. So starting off, these are completely different as a whole. You do have an open concept here with the exposed filter and the heat shield. This is going to incorporate a seal up at the top. So it's going to seal to your hood, keep all of that hot air from your engine out, and keep all that cold air flowing in. Now it is going to be a little bit less protective than your factory system. As you can tell, we have a closed box over here. So if any water were to get into your engine bay, this would be more susceptible to pulling that in. However, if you're in a drier climate, this is going to be a perfect setup for you. Now moving on to the intake tube, this is going to be a 3-inch aluminum intake tube. It's going to have a nice textured black powder coat finish on top. It's going to give you a really nice look in comparison to your factory plastics inside your engine bay, but it's also going to help out with protecting that aluminum underneath. It's also going to increase your airflow and streamline it from your filter into your throttle body in comparison to your factory one where you have a resonator down at the bottom. So you're completely deleting that and optimizing your airflow. So moving on to the filter, you are getting a very large filter in comparison to your factory paper filter, as well as a lot of other filters on the market. So this is going to be made of a 7-layer progressive cotton gauze and synthetic media. So basically what that means in simplistic terms is that this is going to optimize your filtration up to 99.7% while still remaining very high flow. So even though it's optimizing that filtration, it's still pulling in a lot of air and streamlining it right to your engine for those performance gains. Now this is also going to be a dry filter, so it's going to be pretty low maintenance in comparison to your factory filter where you throw it out and get a new one after so many miles. This is very easily washable, cleanable with a shop vac, pressured air. It's going to be very easy to clean, especially in comparison to some of those oiled options where you need a recharge kit and you need to recharge the oil after you wash it. So you're skipping a step here and it's very easy to maintenance. Now, not to mention this comes with everything that you need. You don't need to transfer over anything besides that IAT filter. So speaking of the install, let's go jump into that now. So in order to install our heat shield, we do need to remove these 2 bolts up here, one down at the bottom, and loosen up our radiator support on the back. So I'm going to take a 10mm socket and start to remove these bolts. So then next what we're going to do is loosen up our radiator support on the front. I'm using a 10mm deep socket just to give myself a little bit of clearance. Loosen that up, give that a little gap. You don't want to completely remove that. Now we can grab our heat shield and shimmy that down into place. Now we do need this tab over here to slide behind our bolt. Then you want to line up everything else, make sure everything's sitting properly. So we'll start to reinstall our bolts. So we're going to start with the one down at the bottom. And we're going to move up top. So you are going to have to press this in a little bit. Then we can grab a 10mm socket, tighten those up. Then I'm going to switch over to a ratchet over here and then tighten that up with that same 10mm socket. So now that our heat shield's in place, we can move on to the rest of our intake system. So while we're over here, we can install our filter. Just drop that down on in. Then we can position our clamp. And go ahead and tighten that down. I'm going to use an 8mm socket in order to do that. Once it's a little snug, you can just push the filter up against, make sure that everything is all sitting correctly. Go ahead and tighten that down. So now we can install our intake tube. You want to make sure that your couplers are on the correct side. Also that you have the larger inlet facing your filter and the smaller inlet on the intake tube. So now we can go ahead and just slide that on. Just going to loosen up this clamp with my 8mm socket, just so we can slide that on. You also want to make sure that these 2 holes up here are lining up with your radiator. Now to keep this in place, I am going to take our factory bolts that were already here Go ahead and reinstall them. I'm just going to tighten those down with a 10mm socket. Right, and once that's in place, we can position our clamps. Make sure everything's around the inlets, and then position our clamps so we can go ahead and tighten those down and make them easily accessible. If we do have to take the intake off in the future, you want to make sure that you can access these. So once they're in a good spot, we can go back with our 8mm socket and tighten those down. So we can go up to our throttle body and go ahead and tighten those down. So now that we have all of our clamps in place, we can go ahead and attach our PCV piping. Just have to give it a good tug and it'll click on. Then we can move on to our IAT sensor. That's going to be plugged in. You should hear it click. And after that, you can go ahead and close up your hood and you're all set to go. That's gonna wrap it up for my review and install. Make sure you like and subscribe, and for more videos like this, always keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.